Welcome to this video tutorial on how to create a 3D model with data downloaded from Digimaps. We're going to begin by going to Digimaps and downloading a series of data files that are going to make up our base 3D model. To do this, we're going to click on the Ordnance Survey tab and open up the OS Digimaps. In here we're going to zoom in on the area we want to download our data from. In this case I'm going to be downloading data from London. We'll then find our location, and under the download data option we need to select the draw tool to draw out a rectangle of area of data that we want, and then in the OS Mastermap we're going to first select a topography data file, a building height data file that's going to give us information on all the building models, and then we're also going to select under the land and height data an OS terrain 5 contours, which is essentially some contour lines every 5 meters to give us the rough topography of this area. We're then going to add that to the basket. Under the format we're going to choose DWG format, and under the theme we're going to click standard theme for the topography, and then we're going to request the download. With that requested, you should then get an email to your inbox with the files ready to download, and once you've received that and downloaded them, you should have a folder that looks a little bit like this. In this folder we're going to have 3 separate folders, one for each parcel of data that we've downloaded, and we're going to now bring these into Rhino to start working these into a 3D model. So we're going to open up Rhino, and I'm going to open up a file in meters in this case because the data that I'm going to get from Digimaps is usually in a meters format. We're going to begin by going to File, Import, and we're going to first find the Mastermap Topo standard file. That's our base mapping data. It's going to be in 2D and it's going to give us the area of our file that we're going to be working in. So we're going to select that, we're going to find the AutoCAD drawing file or DWG file, and we're going to hit Open. Hit OK on these because usually these import settings are correct. And we're going to open that in our Rhino file. Now what you might find when you open this is you can't actually see anything on your drawing space. I'm first going to double click in perspective just to make that a little bit larger, and then to zoom into my drawing I'm going to zoom on the zoom selected or the zoom extents tool here, and this is going to zoom into that map which will be selected because I've just brought it into the file. What you'll find is this is really far away from the origin because Digimaps uses a coordinate system and Rhino works to a similar coordinate system but is usually located at 0, 0. Because we're downloading this mapping information from real-world data, this has a real-world coordinate to it which will likely not be located at the 0, 0 mark, which is why it's very far away from the origin. I'm going to leave this here for the time being because my other map data files I'm bringing in are going to line up with this 2D information, and we want to make sure all of these parcels of data line up and coincide with one another. Now before we bring in the next part of this data file, I'm first going to tidy up this information. You can see in my layers I've got lots and lots of different layers that make up all of the bits of information for this map. So what I'm going to do is with my 5 default layers I get in Rhino, I'm just going to rename these. First one I'm going to name is Area, then we're going to make one for all the lines, we're going to make one for text, and we're going to make the last one for points. And this is usually how the data comes in from Digimaps. So with that, we're then going to just open up this panel to be a little bit larger so I can read all of these names of all of these layers, and we're going to put them into the corresponding layer file here. So I'm just going to select all of my area pieces and we're just going to drag and drop that into the area, closing it up as we go. We're going to select my text here, we've got the roadside and rail text, we'll drop that into text, and we're just going to do this to just tidy up any of my layers here so they're a lot neater and more organized, because you can find when you bring in all this information from Digimaps it's very easy to get lost and get disorganized with these. So line of posts will go in lines. You also find that you may not need all of these. I'm going to keep them in these layers for now, but it might be at points you want to actually delete some just to tidy up these layers as well. So we've got one more point there and we'll just drop that in points. So now with these all in their folders, I can turn off my areas to simplify this. I'm going to turn off my text and points as well to just leave me with my lines here. Now in this last layer, I'm just going to double click this and I'm going to call this outline. And in here, we're going to use this to make an outline of my site area. I'm going to make this a color that I can see, so maybe a bright green. And I'm going to turn those areas back on to give me my kind of corner points. Then we're just going to take the rectangle tool here and we're just going to draw a rectangle from one corner all the way to the other, making sure I'm double clicking that outline file to make sure we're in that outline. And then we can turn that area back off. So there we've got our nice bright green outline that we can see. Once we've done that, we're now going to bring in our 3D data. We're going to start by bringing in our topography. And to do that, I'm just going to go import. We're going to go back to my terrain file this time. Look for the TQ folder, or it might be a different letter depending on whereabouts in the world you're downloading from. And we're going to import this Digimaps file here. And then hit OK again. Now what you'll find is that this file won't be constrained to your area that you chose in Digimaps, but rather you're going to get a really large area of mapping data. Now this is usually because it's done on a much larger system, and it will be the same way with our 3D model data. Now we don't actually need all of this information, but again, let's just make a new layer here. I'm going to call it contours, and we're just going to drop all of these files into that contour layer, just to tidy up again. And with these, I'm going to just turn off the spot heights. Make sure we just turn that off singularly. We're going to turn off the labels and any text files as well. So we're just left with our baselines, like so. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in our buildings as a last layer, and we're going to go File, Import. We're going to go to our building height folder, the TQ folder again, and we're going to import that DWG file. You'll notice that the size of this file is much larger than the others because this contains 3D information. So we're going to hit open there, hit OK, and this will bring in all of our 3D data. Now depending on how much you've brought in and the complexity of this area, this might take a slightly longer time to import because it's slightly kind of more information in this data file, and it's containing a lot of 3D geometry on all of the buildings. So we're just going to let this load into our file. Once that's loaded in, it should look something like this. And what you can see is, again, in a similar area to our topography, we've got a much larger area of building information. Now this comes in all on its own layer called buildings for now. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to lock all my other open layers here so I don't accidentally select them. What you might find is once you bring in this building layer, your file gets a bit slower. This is because we've now got a lot of 3D information in our scene. So the first thing we want to do is actually delete all the buildings we don't need. To do this, I'm going to go from my perspective to my top view. We're going to click Zoom Extents to zoom in on the model. And then using my outline as a reference, I'm just going to delete all the buildings that I don't need. Remember, you want to lock all of your other layers apart from that building layer to make sure you don't delete anything you accidentally need. And then we're just going to select some big bits of information at a time and just hit the delete key to delete them. You'll find the more you delete, the faster your file will be, and I'm just going to delete it close enough to that edge line. I don't want it to go too close because you might accidentally delete a building that's inside that line. So you just want to kind of delete just around it, like so. So now we've basically set up our base layers of information. We've got all of our buildings, we've got our topography, and we've got our line work for our map. The next thing we need to do is tidy all of this up, make it a lot neater, and we're going to simplify and constrain it to our outline we've given ourselves. To do this, I'm going to begin with the buildings. So for now, I'm just going to turn off the contours, and I'm also going to turn off those lines and underneath, like so. I'm going to actually keep the outline on just because it's quite useful to see as I work with this file. Now, the first thing you'll notice when you bring these buildings in is they're made up of lots of triangles. This is usually assigned to show that the file type of this is a mesh file rather than a Nurbs file, which is Rhino's native way of modeling in the software. We can check this by picking one building, and if we go to the top left, you'll see one closed mesh has been added. That's telling us that this is actually a mesh object. So the first thing I want to do is actually convert these meshes to Nurbs format so we can work with them more easily in our Rhino file. To do that, I'm just going to select all of my buildings like so, and we're going to type in the command mesh to Nurb, like so. This command will convert all of my meshes into Nurbs objects, and depending on how big of an area you have and how many objects, this might take a longer or shorter amount of time. Once that's been created, it will create those Nurbs objects directly on top of your meshes. And by default, you won't be able to notice it. If you click on an object, you'll have an option for mesh and poly surface, which is our Nurbs object. So what we want to do is actually delete now all of the meshes from the scene. An easy way to do this is just type in select mesh, so SEL and then mesh into your command line. This will select all of the meshes, and then you can hit delete, and it will leave you with just the poly surfaces or the Nurbs objects. Now you won't notice any difference at the moment because these will still have all of our kind of diagonal and triangular faces, but we can use a command to tidy all of these up so they look like nice neat objects that we can then work with. We want to do this because if we create any 2D drawings from this file, it's going to have lots of kind of triangles and polygons on the faces, and this won't look very nice in our final output. So to tidy up these faces, all we need to do is select all of the geometry, go to our 3D tools or our Boolean tools and cascade it under this little arrow here. Then we're going to find the Merge Faces tool, which looks like a little box with a dotted line on it, and we're going to right click on this tool to merge all faces on the objects. Again, this might take a little bit of time depending on how many objects you have, and as you can see in the top left, it's slowly working its way through each of these objects and merging them together. So I'm just going to pause the video and we'll restart it back when this operation has finished. Once that's been completed, you should have a model that looks something like this, with the faces now really cleaned up, and we've got nice neat geometry for all of the buildings in our scene. As a final move, we're now going to trim off the edges so we can constrain our model to our green outline here. To do this, we're going to unlock that outline, and we're just going to start by selecting it and offsetting it to give it a thickness. This is what we're going to then use to trim away that excess building content. So we're going to start just by typing in offset. I'm going to offset it by a distance of around 20 meters. Doesn't really matter, but you kind of want it wide enough so you can see a kind of clear mark between the buildings you're keeping and the buildings you're losing, like so. Then with those two lines selected, I'm going to type in extrude, and this is going to give us a kind of thick area around our model, like so. Now with this piece we can use the Boolean Difference operation to essentially subtract out this shape from all my buildings around the edge. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to select my buildings. To do this, if I click from the left hand side and drag to the right, it will just select the objects within that area. So these are just my buildings. Then I'm going to select the Boolean Difference tool here, and we're going to select the shape I've extruded to subtract this from my buildings model, and we're going to hit enter to confirm the operation. Again, this might take a bit of time if you've got a lot of geometry, but as you can see mine didn't take too long, and if I sort of pan above, we've then got a nice cutout from our kind of area which we want to keep to the area that we don't want. And with that I can now just go around and deselect and delete all of these extra pieces, making sure I don't accidentally get the ones in the middle. The nice thing with using the Boolean Union tool for this particular trim is it leaves us with solid faces. We don't have empty holes on the edges of these. We've still got nice solid objects that we can use and work into later on as well. Once you've done that, we can delete that extra line too. So there we have our building models. These are nice and neat now. We've tidied them all up and we've trimmed off the edges. The next thing I'm going to work on is my terrain. So we're going to open up that contour layer, we're going to unlock it, and we're going to lock up my building layer instead. Now to create the terrain, all I'm going to use is the patch tool on a few of these surfaces. You'll see that we don't actually need any of the information from this side, so all I'm going to do is just select some of the lines closest to my buildings. For now we're just going to lock that outline so we don't accidentally select it, and I'm just going to select these lines here. I'm not too worried that I'm not picking up these because actually the only bit of terrain I want is here, so we just want some of the lines that are surrounding that particular area. Once we've selected them, I'm going to type in patch, and then I'm going to use a 50 by 50 UMV span to give a relative level of accuracy, and we're just going to hit OK to perform that patch command. Again, like the other operations, depending on how many lines you have, how detailed you want this particular piece, this command may take longer or shorter to run, and once that's finished, we're then going to be left with a piece of terrain around this area. Once that's complete, you should have something like this, which is a larger piece of terrain surrounding your particular site. Now, much like the buildings, we're now going to trim this to focus it in on the area we want. So again, I'm going to unlock my outline. I'm going to look from the top down, and we're just going to select that outline there, and then we're going to type in trim into the command line and use it to trim away the excess terrain just by clicking on the outside of that line, and that will trim away any excess areas. Then if we zoom in, you can see we've now got my terrain in that boundary. Now we probably also want to move this terrain onto its own layer, so I'm going to make a brand new layer, call this terrain. Let's make it a kind of green colour so we can see it. And then to move the object onto that terrain, we're just going to select it, right click my terrain layer, and click on the change object layer to move it to that layer. Then we can turn off my contours because we now no longer need them. So there we have a simple terrain model that sits below our buildings. Now, one little thing you might find when you do this is if we look to the bottom of these buildings, is they actually don't sit on that terrain. Now, the reason for this is the slight inaccuracies that we get from Digimaps data. Often these are performed by radar data and have got particular kind of model information for the heights of these buildings, but where they meet the ground is usually a little bit less accurate. You can see some are a bit lower, some are a bit higher, but all of them are pretty much floating above that terrain layer. Now there are a few ways you can fix this, but the way I find most effective is actually kind of re-extruding out these buildings to make them lower than the ground, and then we're going to trim off that ground plane to tidy them back up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make our terrain 3D. To do this, I'm going to select my surface, type in extrude surface here, and we're going to extrude it downwards, making sure that solid is equal to yes to make it into a solid object. And I'm just going to extrude it just a little bit beyond my boundary line here, like so. Now, because the way this works is it extrudes that top layer and kind of mirrors it on the bottom, we now have an uneven base to our surface. So to tidy it up, I'm just going to model a really big block here, and we're going to model it downwards like so. Then with that, we're going to use the Boolean Difference to select my terrain, hit enter, select my box, and it will just trim off that base piece, making it nice and flat on the bottom. So now we have a 3D terrain model. The next thing we're going to do is remodel these buildings so they extend through my terrain. To do this, I'm going to unlock my buildings, double click to make it the active layer, and we're going to lock that terrain model. With the building selected, we're then going to type in explode to break them down into key faces. So just type in explode here, and it will break these models down into individual faces, like so. With that now done, we can then go from the perspective, and I'm going to move into the front view. If you can't see the model, just hit zoom extents to find it. With that front view selected, we're then going to use the marquee tool to just select the very bottom of the model. So you can see here I'm just skimming on that bottom layer. What this would do is it will select all the geometry except all the top faces of my buildings. This will also delete some of these smaller ones, which I usually don't need because they're usually marking out kind of smaller bits of street furniture, which actually for this I don't want too much. If you want to keep them, you can always go around and deselect them, but in this case I'm just going to delete them from this model. With that selected, we're then going to hit delete, making sure we don't accidentally select our outline in the kind of running of that, and then hit delete to leave us just with those top model faces, as you can kind of see in my perspective file here. Now with those faces, we can select them again, and now we're going to type in extrude, again using the extrude surface to extrude them well below my model, and I'm going to extrude them so they're very long this time. So they're cutting right through that surface, like so. So now you can see they're kind of intersecting that plane and beyond. Now to tidy this up, we're just going to use the Boolean Difference tool once again. So we're just going to select all of my buildings. We're going to go to the Boolean Difference tool. We're going to, in this time, we're not going to delete the cutter. So instead of delete cutters is yes, we're going to set that to no, because we want to keep this object after we've performed this operation. Make sure that terrain's unlocked. Click on the green terrain file, and then we're going to hit enter to perform that Boolean operation. Again, this may take a little bit of time depending on how many buildings you have. Once that's complete, you'll notice that the terrain has essentially cut in half those building extrusions. So we can now delete all of the ones below the terrain, like so, and we're left with nice neat models on top of the terrain which correspond exactly with the base because we've trimmed them exactly to align with that base model. So now it's nice and neat to that base piece. As a final piece we want to do, we're going to find our lines from our original line file here. We'll just put this on ghosted so we can see them. And we're going to project them back down onto this model here. Now I'm not going to project all the lines because we don't need them, so for now let's just double click on this lines file. We're going to hide my terrain and my base, and we're just going to take the road markings and some of the general outlines. So in here, let's turn off my building outline and building division. Anything that we don't think we need. I don't need the electoral boundary or the post line, edge of tunnel. And we're just going to keep the kind of main road lines. Once we've got those, we're then going to select them, copy them, make sure we're in the vertical position by hitting this vertical option in my copy tools, and we're just going to move this above my terrain like so. With these as well, you'll notice that some are dotted, some are different colours, so if you want to get rid of those settings, if we go into the properties, we're just going to set this to a default layer to put them all on the same layer for now. Make it black, display color black, line type by layer, and display mode also by view there. Now that's set, you should notice that they're all kind of solid lines, which is what we want here. And then as a final move, we're going to open up that terrain layer again, and we're going to click on this project curves tool, select my curves from my top default layer, making sure it's unlocked first, and then we're going to hit enter, and we're going to pick the surface we want to project them onto, which is this piece on my terrain. Hit enter again, and that will project those lines down onto that surface, matching the topography of that particular surface there. We can then delete these copied ones, and we can turn back on our building layers. So now we've got left is our roads mapped on to that surface. We now have our buildings which match the model, and we've got a nice neat terrain model to work with. So that was just a quick video tutorial on how you create a 3D site model from data downloaded from Digimaps. I hope you found this video tutorial useful, and once you've made this you can then work into this model, design into it, create excavations or build up from these layers, because we've made nice neat geometry that we can now work into. Thanks for watching, and if you want to watch any other videos on 3D modelling or rendering in Rhino, please do check out the videos on the channel.